in defense of history and the liberal arts. Or, hello, I studied history. What can I do for you? How many times have you heard a college student say, I'm studying history, and your first thought is, so you're going to be a teacher? Or maybe you're an employer, and you've seen resume after resume from students who received history or other humanities-centered degrees, and you think to yourself, poor idealistic kids, that was such a waste for them to study in this modern economy. There's nothing that they can do for me, before throwing the resume into your shredder. You aren't alone. It's become the norm to bash the study of anything that doesn't have immediately visible market value. Educational policy is on a decidedly anti-humanities trend, and if it's not a STEM degree, it's written off as basically worthless. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with studying a STEM subject, but I do feel that just because something doesn't come from a STEM field doesn't mean that it has no value. Society in general is underestimating the worth of students with majors in the humanities, and in history in particular. Those history majors can do a lot for you, no matter what field you're in or what kind of business you're running. But hey, if I'm going to defend the study of history, I need to clear up some myths about what history is. History has a bit of a reputation problem within society at large, and many of the critiques are justifiable. But many are based on myths, or just plain ignorance about what history is. So let's do a little myth-busting, shall we? The first, and arguably most difficult myth about history, is that history is simply memorizing names and dates. The Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Magna Carta in 1215, Martin Luther's theses in the Napoleonic Wars, Mongols on the march in the U.S. Civil War. Wait, the French Revolution starts, the Byzantine Empire collapses, the Code of Hammurabi in 1772 BCE-ish? Who cares, right? If you think that's all history is, it's understandable. This is a difficult myth to bust, but it needs to be busted. I think this myth is the hardest to shake for two reasons. Because history does indeed involve the memorization of important names and dates. And because, quite frankly, the educational system, especially K through 12, does a great job of teaching history by degrading it into nothing but a list of names and dates. That does nothing but make history, capital B, boring. And since most people don't study history beyond K through 12, this myth is never corrected. So why is it taught that way? That's complicated, and involves everything from our over-reliance on standardized testing, which tends to force a kind of memorization into the learning process, to bad teaching methodologies, and even administrative or school board attempts to redefine history curriculum for political or ideological purposes. It doesn't help that many administrators see the history or social studies position as a convenient place to stick the football or basketball coach during the non-sports season. Many history majors who wish to go into teaching often find out that the positions they want are reserved for someone who can coach the football team onto yet another winning season. Whether or not that person actually knows history is irrelevant. It's just something for them to do when they're not coming up with winning plays. For the record, I do like football as a sport, and I realize that there are exceptions to every rule. There are some excellent history teachers out there who are doing their best to inspire passion for history in their students. But what I am arguing is that the system is working against them. The Atlantic magazine interviewed Columbia University history professor Eric Foner in January of 2014, who illustrated this point perfectly. Quote, "We have to get away from this idea that any old person can teach history. A lot of history teachers in this country are actually athletic coaches. I mention this in class, and students always say, 'Oh yeah, Coach Smith, he taught my history course.' Why? Well, Coach Smith is the football coach, and in the spring he's not doing much, and they say, well, put him in the history course. He can do that." They wouldn't put him in a French course, or in a physics course. The number one thing is, you have to know history to actually teach it. That seems like an obvious point, but it's sometimes ignored in the schools. Even more than that, I think it's important that people who are teaching history do have training in history. The bottom line is you do need a basic grasp of the dates and names of those who have been involved in the making of history, whether they be a well-known name like Thomas Jefferson or the name of a local suffragette in your hometown. That's why this is a hard myth to shake. But knowing the names and dates is not what history is. True history is about so much more than that. The next myth is that history is learning useless facts that are only good for Jeopardy! This is a persistent myth that stems from the idea that if you aren't going for your PhD or planning to teach at either the K-12 or collegiate level, the lessons you learn from history are of little value in the modern economy. The only problem with this idea is that it can be easily proven false by taking a look at what a historian actually does. So, what does a historian do? They gather evidence. Those names and dates we spoke about a bit ago, guess what? They are evidence, and it's not the only type. Evidence includes everything from artifacts to archival documents, architecture, rituals, and other tangible and at times intangible products created by humans. The historian takes this evidence and uses it to build context. History is nothing without context. Don't think context is important? Let's test it. Here is a fact. Representatives from 13 English colonies met in Philadelphia and produced a document called the Declaration of Independence. That fact is all that you know. That's it. If you're an American, you are probably associating this fact with images and ideas like freedom, patriotism, 4th of July, and the like. But where are those ideas coming from? They are coming from the context that the meeting was held in, which is something that you know from your schooling. Those ideas are not coming from the fact itself. If this simple fact was all that you knew, would it be important? Would you bother to remember it? The simple answer to this question is no, because the fact by itself is meaningless unless context is applied. Look at the fact again. Do you find yourself asking questions about it? Maybe you want to know why they're meeting, or maybe you want to know why they felt the need to produce the Declaration of Independence. Maybe you want to know why these colonies had decided that independence from England was preferable to remaining as colonies. These are all contextual questions. Remove the evidence from its context, and it is diminished in value to the point of near uselessness. With evidence and context in hand, the historian next begins an analysis. Using the evidence you have and what you know of the context, you can begin to fit the evidence into the context and the context into the evidence to answer bigger questions. This is where the fun begins, since you're often forced to adjust your view of the evidence and context. For example, if a piece of evidence you have doesn't fit with the others, why not? Is the context still correct if a piece of evidence is contradictory or missing? Is the absence of evidence, in fact, evidence for or against the context? While you wouldn't normally associate analytical thinking with history, you should. After the analysis is complete, the historian creates a picture of what they're studying. Building on all of the previous levels, the historian can see the event or concept that they are studying clearly, both the moving parts and the entire machine in action. The picture that is created represents a deep level of understanding that is beneficial not only to history, but as you will soon see, to other disciplines as well. What happens to the picture the historian created? The historian communicates it to others. It might be in writing, it might be in lectures, or it might be in the form of exhibits, reenactments, art, or theater, but communication skills are part and parcel of the historian's toolkit. When history is poorly taught, as it often is, students rarely progress out of the first two levels, giving rise to the myth that history is useless. But as we'll soon see, the skills that are required by the historian are very useful in any field. Coincidentally, studying history can also make you awesome at Jeopardy! But that's beside the point. The final myth to bust is that history is not relevant to today. This is the easiest myth to bust because all you have to do is search Google to see exactly how relevant history is to our modern world. As an example, let's look at the unrest in Ukraine, which started in 2013. At first, this looks like a mere political event. Ousted President Yanukovych's government rejected an accord which included strengthening economic ties with Europe in November of 2013. The reason for the rejection, at least publicly, was to favor an accord with Russia instead. This rejection caused rioting and protests. When Yanukovych brought in the military to control the protests, their use of violence against the protesters led to the toppling of his government and the eventual occupation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia, who stated that they were worried the violence would spill over the border between the two countries. This occupation of the Crimea led to international condemnation of Russia, economic sanctions against senior Russian and Yanukovych government officials, and economic turmoil in Europe and the rest of the world, as Russia threatened to cut off gasoline and heating oil exports to Europe, which depends heavily on them. These events threatened to fire up the Cold War, which had major impacts on both the US and Russia in terms of politics and economics. The unrest in the region also cost the lives of innocents, both on the ground in the fighting that was ignited between pro- and anti-Russian Ukrainians, but also among the rest of the world, when a passenger plane carrying 298 people mainly Dutch, Malaysian, and Australian nationals, was shot down just outside of Donetsk, a region which had seen heavy fighting between the pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian forces. Just like our colonial example earlier, we're missing the central piece of this puzzle. Why? Why did the Ukrainians balk at stronger ties with Russia? Why were there counter-protests which indicated that at least a portion of the Ukrainian population favored the Russian ties? Why do certain areas of Ukraine seem to identify more with Russia while others don't? In order to answer these questions, you need to look at the history of Russia, the Ukraine, and Eastern Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, if not farther back than that. If you're a historian with knowledge of that area of the world, you would understand that Western Europe and Russia have been antagonistic towards each other for centuries, a good demonstration of which is the fighting known as the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. That's the 1800s for the math challenged. The Crimean War resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths and untold damage to the land in the region that is now the Crimean Peninsula and the Ukraine. A historian would also understand that the rise of Stalin to commander of the USSR had a devastating impact on the people of the Ukraine, leading to the deaths of as many as 5 million Ukrainian peasants who starved to death during a massive famine in 1933. A famine which could have been alleviated had Stalin distributed grain surplus that was being held in reserve in Russia. You would also know that while in power, Stalin forcibly removed the ethnic group known as the Tatars from their homeland in the Crimean Peninsula and eastern Ukrainian region. He replaced them with ethnic Russians who he could rely on for support. Moving into more modern times, you would know that in the 1950s, the Crimean Peninsula itself, which was under the control of Russia, was transferred to the Ukraine under Russian President Khrushchev. Now it's starting to make more sense why eastern Ukraine became such a battleground in the modern conflict, and why support for Russia tends to be concentrated there, while there is fear of Russia in the western part of the country. By knowing just the basics of the history of the area, the picture of modern problems in the region comes into focus much more sharply. If you're going to react to an issue like the unrest in the region and how it affects the rest of the world, it's very important to have a clear image of how the situation evolved in the first place. On a side note, if you're interested in seeing a great video on the Ukrainian unrest, check out John Green's video, Ukraine Explained, on YouTube. John puts together great videos on all kinds of subjects, when he's not busy writing books like The Fault in Our Stars, that is. Click the link to check it out. So now that we've busted some myths of history, let's take a closer look at what history actually is. History is investigation and data gathering. Much like detectives, the first step in doing history is the same as running an investigation, gathering your data. For historians, this data can lay in archives, in museums, private collections, ancient manuscripts, papyrus scrolls, or even under the very ground you're standing on. History is analysis, both the analysis of your evidence and the analysis of the context in which your evidence was created. Evidence without context is meaningless, but context without evidence is false. Much like Sherlock Holmes, the work of the historian is also the work of deduction. Simply reading a manuscript or letter is not enough. It's only the first level of analysis. You also have to ask what they mean, what context they were written in, how the context may have shaped the document you're reading, and how the particular document may have shaped its context. History is the big picture, meaning that history is the examination of variables and their effects on events, places, and people. How do the evidence and context shape the big picture, and how does the big picture shape the context and evidence? This is what a historian is developing using their analytical thinking skills. History is the clear communication of these events and situations, communicating the big picture to others. Historians have to be able to paint a picture with their words to communicate both the general concepts and the details and nuances of the picture depending on the audience they're talking to. There are few, if any, professions who read, write, and present as much as the historian does, so written and verbal communication skills are finely honed. History can also be the extrapolation of the knowledge that you've gathered and comparing it to similar situations or different times. Most of the time this is just a fun thought experiment, such as how would the world be different if Hitler had won World War II, which also happens to be something serious historians won't entertain for anything other than getting creative juices flowing. But sometimes, as in the example of unrest in the Ukraine, an understanding of history can teach you a valuable lesson about the culture and people involved, which can help guide you towards better answers or responses to a situation. You know the old saying about history repeating itself? While it never repeats itself completely, a student of history can easily recognize patterns, and patterns can be very helpful in determining which course of action is the correct one in any given situation. So, as a student of history, what can I do for you? Let's look at all of the transferable skills that history provides. As a student of history, I am an analyst. Do you have a problem with falling sales? Maybe you have a bug in your software system, or your recent customer satisfaction surveys came back with a less than thrilling result. I can analyze those problems. Why can I do that for all of these seemingly unrelated fields? Because analysis and analytical thinking is a skill that is highly transferable. The specific knowledge that you need to tackle any problem, such as computer coding, statistics, marketing, or any specific software platform, is something that you can teach to almost anyone. Need someone who knows banking? That can be taught. Need someone who knows medical IT? That can be taught. Need someone who knows finance? That can be taught. Need someone who knows auditing? Yep, that can be taught too. If you think about it, teaching someone any of those skills is relatively easy, but trying to teach someone how to analyze a problem is much more difficult. The question is simple. Would you rather spend your time teaching someone your specific industry, or trying to teach someone who is not analytical to think analytically? As a student of history, I am always looking for the context of any given situation. This means that I am ideal for solving problems or tracking down workflow issues. As part of their problem-solving arsenal, students of history are constantly shifting between the bird's-eye view of a situation and the specific evidence right in front of them. This means that we can look for the cause of problems which may be less than obvious. For instance, let's say that you are a hospital or clinic and your clinical physician order entry system received a software update from your vendor, which changed the way that diagnosis codes interface with other software programs. This programming change was behind the scenes, so staff at your facility did not know about it. At the end of the month, your billing department, which runs on a different software system set to interface with your CPOE, realizes that their bills are inaccurate after many of the claims for payment were rejected from your patient's insurance companies. If you limit your examination of the billing problem to the billing department and its policies, procedures, and software program, you are not going to find the root cause of the problem. What you need is a contextual thinker to run a root cause analysis, somebody who can get outside the box of the billing department and find out what other factors may have coincided or contributed to the billing problem. This type of contextual thinking is familiar territory to the student of history. As a student of history, I am also a translator and interpreter. I'm not necessarily talking about interpreting languages, although many students who receive advanced study in history can often at least read another language, if not several, depending on their area of study. I'm talking about interpreting complex ideas into their component parts and making them more accessible for non-experts. Historians are writers and public speakers who are constantly giving presentations and writing works intended for very different audiences, everyone from industry experts to grade school students. The variety of audiences we present to means that interpretation skills are a must. You won't convey the same presentation to different groups of people, so thinking on your feet is required if you feel like your audience is either getting lost because you're being too complex for them, or if they're getting bored because you aren't challenging them enough. This particular skill makes historians, especially public historians or museum professionals, skilled presenters and educators. If you have a software program that needs to be taught to end users, for example, you need an interpreter, and historians make great interpreters. As a student of history, I am a big picture thinker, which is a skill that is sadly lacking in our modern world. To the historian, 500 years is the blink of an eye. We often cover more than that in a 1-hour lecture for courses like Western Civilization. Think about all the change that's occurred in the last 500 years, and imagine trying to boil it down to 50 minutes. Historians do this on a daily basis, and that means that we naturally gravitate towards the bird's eye view. Many historians have studied or researched outside of the U.S., meaning that they have been exposed to different languages, cultures, and societal norms. This not only adds to our big picture thinking, it means that historians generally are comfortable with unfamiliar people, languages, or cultures. In this increasingly globalized world, having people on board at your organization who have this kind of experience is a huge benefit. It also means that you have a go-to person when you need to see a particular project from the big picture perspective. As a student of history, I am also an information manager. One of the technical skills that any student of history learns is how to find and keep track of relevant information and evidence. When we study history at the master's or PhD level, we as students are investing at least 2 years and possibly as many as 5 in the process. We are researching via the internet, in libraries and archives all across the country, and sometimes even across the globe. When you are trying to write a coherent analytical work from a large pool of data that you've gathered over 1 or more years, you need to know how to manage the information that you gathered. As a student of history, I know how to organize information, determine its relevance, and track it for future use, which is an ideal skill in any industry. And finally, as a student of history, I am a researcher. The value of having a skilled researcher on your staff cannot be understated, but good research is a skill that takes practice. As anyone who has done any kind of research knows, it's easy to fall down the rabbit hole and wind up following a research path which doesn't advance your big picture project. When researching, you have to keep the big picture in mind, which is something that students of history do on a regular basis. It's time to put it all back together. To review, what does a historian do? A historian reviews the past in context and determines how issues came to be. This requires research, analytical thinking skills, flexibility, and information management skills. A historian communicates the past clearly and efficiently, which requires communication skills, thinking on your feet, and creativity. A historian provides solutions and likely scenarios, which requires communication skills, more analytical thinking, flexibility, and adaptability. Finally, historians also research the likely impact of decisions and multiple outcomes, which requires research, analytical thinking, flexibility, creativity, and information management skills. Let's look at all of this in a slightly different form. On the left side of your screen are the skills that students gain by studying history. On the right side of your screen are soft skills that employers have specified they want from new college graduates, according to a recent survey of employers by the Chronicle of Higher Education and the American Public Media Marketplace. The results of the survey were presented in March of 2013. You can click the link here to see the survey in full. To quote from the article, quote, "When it comes to the skills most needed by employers, job candidates are lacking the most in written and oral communication skills, adaptability, managing multiple priorities, making decisions, and problem solving. I wonder if students of history would fare any better in these required areas." Just as I thought, the skills acquired through the study of history are a wonderful match for these soft skills that employers want. And remember, the technical skills needed for certain positions are things which can easily be taught. But these soft skills, these are far more difficult to teach. Special thanks to all these people and places for making their art, music, and information available for use by others like me. Click the links to check out more from them. And remember, check out John Green's YouTube channel for more great informational video content. Music for this presentation was used under the Creative Commons licensing program with permission of the artist for non-commercial use and sampling. To learn more about Creative Commons licensing, visit creativecommons.org/about.